Welcome back to Gary's Economics. Today we're going to explain who pays tax. So I want to do a quick explanation basically of exactly how the tax system works and who pays tax. Largely because there are a lot of sound bites bouncing around that are intentionally misleading, which are designed to make you think or to make people think that the tax system is already unfair to the rich. So the big one which you hear, which I get thrown at me sometimes when I do interviews, is that the richest 1% already pay 28% of tax. Now this is very misleading. So the first thing is that is actually not the richest 1% of people. It is the top 1% of taxpayers. Now every year we get the Times Rich list, the richest people in the country, and we also get another list of the top taxpayers in the country. And I think it's really interesting to go and compare these two lists. Often what you'll find is there's almost nobody who is on both of the lists, which I think is quite interesting. And that is because the people who pay the most tax, whilst they are generally rich people, they are not the richest people in the country. And we're going to explain in this video why the people who pay the most tax are not the richest people in the country. The second reason that statistic is misleading is because that is talking about only income tax. So it's saying the people who pay the top 1% income taxpayers are paying 28% of income tax. But actually income tax is only one form of tax. There are other forms of tax which are tilted much more towards ordinary people. So for example, the government raises more from VAT and from national insurance than it raises on income tax. VAT is a tax which is on consumption. Ordinary and poorer people pay a much higher rate of VAT as a percentage of their incomes, and that is because ordinary people spend a much higher percentage of their income. National insurance is a tax which specifically excludes income from wealth, which is the vast majority of the income that richer people make. So basically, these statistics are misleading, and the best way for you to understand it is for me to explain exactly what is really happening, which is we have a tax system which is broadly progressive, meaning people who have higher incomes pay higher tax at sort of ordinary income levels. So if you are earning £100,000 a year from your work, you will pay a higher rate of income tax and tax overall than somebody earning £15,000 or £20,000 a year. That stays true up until about £150,000, £200,000. Then once you start seeing people who are earning above £200,000, what we actually see is that the rates of tax paid start to fall significantly. And the reason for this is that our current tax system is very well designed for taxing working people. So if you work for your money, which most people do, or I work for the money that I made, especially if you're earning a high income, you will pay relatively high levels of tax, into the sort of 60% once we include national insurance and income tax and VAT. But the tax system as it is not really designed to tax people whose income comes from wealth. If you don't understand the concept of income from wealth, I would recommend you watch the video on the channel, What is Wealth? That basically explains that there's a huge amount of wealth in this country, not just housing, but also a lot of commercial wealth, land, shopping centres, office buildings, factories, wind farms, industrial wealth. And these are owned by richer people. And they generate enormous amounts of income from this wealth. So if we consider someone like Rishi Sunak, who is worth about, according to the Times Rich list, £700 million, he will make every year from his wealth probably something like £30 million. Remember, that's not from his work, right? That is the money that he just gets for owning lots of stuff like your mortgage or your house. The way the tax system is designed, it is very possible for people such as Rishi Sunak, who generate huge amounts of income from wealth, to legally avoid, well, first of all, they don't have to pay income tax on a lot of that. And they can legally avoid many forms of taxes. So the end result is, in many cases, these people pay rates as low as 10% or sometimes even lower on the income from their wealth. So what we actually have is a tax system which is progressive for ordinary people. So the rate you pay is higher the more you earn. And then once you get into this realm of very, very wealthy people, the rate starts to collapse. And in particular, the rate on inherited wealth, especially for phenomenally wealthy people, falls to 0. So you end up in a situation where the tax system is not really progressive. It's basically progressive for ordinary people and essentially optional for wealthy families. I think that's probably the fairest way to describe the tax system that we have, which is essentially it's a class-based tax system. So I'm a relatively wealthy person. I'm worth, more than a couple of £1,000,000, and I earned that through working. So when I worked, I had to pay, it was actually a 50% top rate of income tax at the time. At the same time as I earned a few £1,000,000 from working, the Duke of Westminster inherited £9 billion, which is, maybe 3,000 times what I earned, and he paid nothing. So I think that really highlights essentially what we have is a class-based tax system. I earned many, many thousands of times less than the Duke of Westminster, but I come from a poor family, so I have to pay 50% tax. The Duke of Westminster earned 1,000 times more than me, but he is the Duke of Westminster, so he pays 0% tax. And I think it's quite interesting that in a way the tax system is kind of moving back towards what it was like in medieval times, where essentially working people pay tax to the aristocracy. Because if you look at, for example, someone like Rishi Sunak, the amount of tax that he pays is enormously less than the amount of cash flows he receives from working people. And increasingly, a big chunk of the tax that you pay literally goes towards paying government debt interest to the rich. So you pay your tax, a lot of that goes to the rich. Then you pay your rent, that goes to the rich. You pay your mortgage, that goes to the rich. You go to buy food, and that goes to the landowners. You buy energy, and that goes to the energy owners. So essentially, what you have essentially looks increasingly like a very, very extractive system. And the lack of taxation of the rich creates a big problem with flows of wealth. So recently, I've been really trying to lobby politicians, very unsuccessfully, to start taxing wealth, tax working people less on their income and tax wealth more. And, I've been trying to push them to tax people who have a wealth of over £10 million, 1% of their wealth. And they don't want to do that. But wealthy people will make 3, 4, 5% income on their wealth anyway. So what that means is, even if you were to tax them 1%, they would still generate an enormous excess income that they could then use to compete with your kids to buy property. And I think when you think about the tax system, I think another story that illustrates it quite well is, I've got friends, I think of one friend who's, very well educated, and he earns probably about 3 times average income now. And he lives with his mum to try and save up money to buy a house. And because he's earning higher than average income, he probably pays, above 50%, if you include national insurance on his income. And when he goes to buy properties, those properties end up getting bought by people who got given £500,000 tax-free from their mum. I think this kind of highlights what's happening. My friend is paying 50% because he's from a poor family. And that person who buys that house is paying 0% on their income because they're from a better off family. And then the Duke of Westminster inherits £9 billion and pays nothing because he's from a very, very rich family. So yeah, the tax system as it is, I should probably just talk briefly about VAT and national insurance. National insurance is a form of income tax that only applies to working people, only applies to work. So, my income, I pay income tax on some of my income, but I don't have to pay any national insurance because I don't work. Well, I do work, but I don't make any money from this work. So we have a form of tax, national insurance, specifically targeted at working people. Then you have VAT, which is on consumption. Now, very rich people consume very, very small percentage of their income, so they pay very little VAT. So you have VAT targeted at ordinary people, national insurance targeted at working people, income tax avoidable for the rich, inheritance tax avoidable for the rich. The end result is you have a tax system which looks progressive for ordinary people because you're only comparing yourself to people around you who are ordinary people. At the same time, you have this small group of people who are phenomenally rich, who are increasingly buying everything, who you don't often get to see in day-to-day life, that are paying nothing, generating huge amounts of income and using that income to buy the rest of the assets. So who pays tax? If you're a working person in an ordinary financial situation, you. Who doesn't pay tax? Very wealthy families. the people who receive your mortgage payments, your rent payments, the money spent on food and bills. They don't pay any tax on that. And they are then using that money to buy the rest of the wealth. So it creates this really bad structural problem where, because we're not taxing the rich, because they have these huge incomes, they are then buying all of the rest of the assets. So they kind of end up being like a black hole for assets, sucking all of the assets out of society. And if we don't take any action against that, it is inevitable that in 20 years, 30 years, ordinary families will not have any assets left, basically. It'll be very difficult to own property, and if you do own property, you'll be forced to have an enormous mortgage. So yeah, tax is paid by working people. It's not paid by the rich. If we don't do something about that, inequality will grow massively. We will lose our middle class, who will lose their assets. I'd really encourage you, if you're an older person who owns property, to think about what that means for your kids and your grandkids. If you're a younger person, this is probably no news to you, but try and think about ways to communicate clearly to older generations, what this means for the future of the country. If we don't fix the tax system, then the majority of the people in this country will end up being very poor. But if we do fix the tax system, we can change it. So yeah, understand what's happening, share this video, and yeah, help us to change it. Thank you. Happy? Money currently is flowing from the government to the rich, leaving the government with big piles of debt and the rich with big piles of money. There is one other thing they can do with that massive amount of income. They can buy your mum's house.